Next on our page is that big old button. It's currently real small. We're going to get it to look a little more like its final version, the big "what should I do" button. Now, step one, as always, is going to be to create a new place for those styles and to load that file in. Then we can actually define the selector, the styles, and get everything working correctly. I'm going to make a new file in components, and we're going to call this one button.scss, and inside of here for the big button we're going to be using the class big-button. We're going to put some styles in there in just a moment. Before we do, let's go ahead and actually load this file in. Inside of styles.scss, we're going to load in the new file in the components folder. At import, in there, /components, and the file is called button. Excellent. And now that the button file is loaded in, we can actually define some styles. And let's go ahead and start with the most notable feature, the background color. That background color is the nice bright purple, and this is a great example of something we want to break out into a variable. We're going to be using that purple elsewhere in the application, so let's define it inside of settings first. Over here, purple. And I'm going to set it equal to the hex value that I picked out. That is going to be 83. Then we're going to move on to 57C5. There we go. We got a little preview showing up inside of Visual Studio Code. And if we actually use the purple value, we should see it showing up. That's what we'll start with right here. Background, purple. Now, if we save all of our files, we do still need to actually apply the class. I'm going to go ahead and do that where it lives. That is inside of the action component file. In here, we have the button. We have our big old button. Let's go ahead and apply the class to it so it actually shows up. Class name, big-button. Now, if we save the application, we should see at least the purple background. It still looks terrible, but that is a step in the right direction. Now that we know our styles are at least showing up, let's go ahead and knock out the rest of the styles necessary to make this button looking like it should. The next thing we're going to do is get rid of that border. This button is not going to have a border on all sides. So what I'm going to do is set border equal to none. Now, I do want to have that 3D sort of effect, so what we're going to do is set a border on the bottom. Right here, you can see there's a slightly darker purple. So we are going to set up below that border bottom. The first of three values is the width for the border. I'm going to be sticking with 0.6 rem. The next is the type of border. We're going to be using a solid border as opposed to something like a dashed border. And the final value is the actual color we want to use. We want a darker shade of that purple. Now, inside of SCSS, we actually have access to a set of predefined functions that we can use to do what functions do. They take in values and they return a different value. The function we're going to be using is called darken. Darken gets called just like you'd call a JavaScript function, and it returns some value. So whatever comes back from darken is going to be the color value for this border. And what we're going to do is pass in the two arguments it expects. The first is the color we want to darken, and we already have that. It is available to us via the purple variable. And next up is the percent we want to darken it by. We're going to go ahead and darken it by 10%. Now, the end result is that if we save our file, we're going to see we now have a border on the bottom of the button, and it is 10% darker than the actual button itself. There are other SCSS functions available to us. If you want to get a complete list, you can head over to Google. We're going to Google Sass reference functions. This should get us over to the right location, and we're looking for this one. This contains all of the built-in functions that Sass provides to you. Here they start off with a quick overview of exactly what's going on, and then they break them all out into categories. We have RGB related functions, we have HSL ones, that's hue, saturation, and lightness, and that's exactly what the darken function would be categorized as. It's darkening the color. And if we scroll down, we can see it lives right here alongside of other ones like saturate, lighten, and adjust hue. If we click darken, it's going to take us down to the actual docs for that one. We can see it takes in the color and amount. Both of those parameters are defined clearly right here, and that also returns a color. That is the end result of darkening the color that was passed in. So if you do want to take advantage of any other functions, they're all defined here, and there are quite a few useful ones, especially when you're manipulating color values. For now though, we have darken in place, letting us set up that bottom border, and we can continue on styling this button. The next thing we're going to do is set the color. We're going to be setting the color of this button to white, and we're also going to be adjusting the font weight, setting font weight equal to bold. We want a nice big bold font. Currently we have a small, skinny, hard to read font, so right here we will also define font size. We already have a value for this. We're just going to use the large size variable. Excellent. Now if I save the button partial, the application is going to refresh. Well, we're not quite there. We have indeed taken a step in the right direction. Things are looking pretty good. We just got to adjust some of the spacing. Currently, it's not taking up the full width and everything is pushed right up against each other. We want to have a lot of space between the button text and the border of the button. Let's go ahead and knock that out over inside of the button partial. First up, let's set the width equal to 100%. That's going to make sure that the button takes up the entire container width, all 60 REMs worth of it, and that's exactly what we get. We're also going to go ahead and set a bottom margin. That's going to put a bit of space between the button and the stuff that lives below the button. Margin bottom. And we're going to be using our XL variable size. So right here, $XL size. Excellent. If we save things, we're going to be almost done. Everything looks pretty good except for the spacing inside of the button. To do that, we're going to be setting up a bit of padding, and we're going to be using a custom value for this. That'll be 2.4 REM. This one is not going to be reused elsewhere. It is specifically for the big button, so we can always leave it defined in line. Now, if we go ahead and actually save things, the end result is the button looking like it should. We have a nice big button. It has a lot of space between it and the stuff below it and above it. And we also have space inside between the button border and the button text. The last thing we want to do is customize the button styles when it goes from disabled to enabled and vice versa. So right now we have a disabled button, but it's showing up as the bright purple color. In the final version of the application, when we have no items, it's going to be faded away and non-clickable with the default cursor. And as we add items, it's going to become that bright purple, and we will have the actual cursor showing up, letting you know that you can actually click that button to pick the option. So let's go ahead and start setting that up. And the first thing we're going to do is add another selector for big button right here, big button. And we are going to select big button only when it's disabled. So we're going to be using the built-in disabled pseudo class. That is :disabled. And then we'll provide the styles for the disabled big button. All we're going to do is set the opacity equal to 0.5. That's going to make it see through a little bit, and the end result is exactly what we have in the final version. It appears faded out when there are no items, but as we add items, it becomes nice and vibrant. Then you'll notice the cursor still is not changing, so we can go ahead and fix that. And this is something we actually want to tweak for all buttons. You can notice it's not showing up for any of our buttons, so we can set that one up over inside of the base file. Right here, we're going to add two quick ones. First up, button. We're going to target all buttons and set their cursor equal to pointer. That's the little hand that we just saw over in the final version of the app. And we're also going to target all buttons when they're disabled. And in that case, we're going to go ahead and just set the cursor equal to default. Now we're going to have the exact same cursor rules applied to all of our buttons. That includes the big button, and that includes the other ones down below. If I remove all of the items and the big button becomes disabled, you can see the cursor does not switch to pointer. It stays at the default. So there we have it. We have all of the styles for the big old button in place. Now, there are other buttons that make up the application. The big button is pretty special. It has a lot of attributes that the other buttons just are not going to share. So I'm not going to try to reuse the code and override the properties. Instead, we're going to create a separate class for our regular buttons, like the purple button and the button for remove and remove all, which is really just this button with no background and a different color. So in that case, we can reuse some styles. This one is just so distinct and has so many styles that aren't needed down below. If we did try to override things, we would just be creating quite a mess. So for those smaller buttons, we're going to go ahead and set up a new button class right here. And we'll also leave a comment up above for the big button. And we're going to start defining some of the styles that make up our smaller purple button. First up, we're going to have a background color. of purple. We are also going to make sure to remove that border none, but we are going to set it on the bottom. So border bottom. This time we will be using 0.3 REM. And we will once again have a solid border, and we're still going to go ahead and darken purple. So darken. We're going to darken purple by 10%. Now down below that, what is next for this button? We're going to set the color equal to white. We're going to set the font weight equal to 500. And then finally, we're going to set the padding. And for the padding, we're going to stick to a nice small padding. I'm going to create a new variable for that. We're going to call this one S size. So that'll be small size. Now, if we save the file, things are going to crash because the S size variable is not defined, but we can go ahead and set that up right here. S size, and we will go ahead and leave this one at 1.2 REM. Excellent. Let's go ahead and save these settings so the variable actually exists. Then we can save the button partial. And the last thing left to do is to use this class somewhere. The one place that we're going to use it for the moment is going to be inside of the add option form. Inside of there, we have the button for add option. This is going to be one of the purple buttons, so we will give it a class name equal to button. Now we can go ahead and actually save add option. The application should refresh, and down below, we do have our purple button showing up. The stuff around it looks pretty terrible, but the button itself is looking really nice. Now, when we explored BEM, I mentioned that there was B for block, E for element, and we've already used both of those, and M for modifier. We're going to go ahead and create a modifier for the button block, which is going to allow us to take that small purple button and make a few tweaks to it, getting it to look more like the link-based button where we just change a couple of things. We remove the background and the border, and we adjust the color of the text. So to get that done, let's look at the syntax. Now remember, this syntax is just a BEM naming convention. It is not enforced in any way, but the whole point of using the convention is so it's easy to parse through all of your code and figure out exactly what's going on. So for a button element, we would have done something like button underscore underscore, whatever's inside the button. Maybe we have a drop down or an icon, so something like that. For modifiers, instead of 2 underscores, we use 2 hyphens. Then we give the name to the modified version of the button. And I'm just going to call this one link, since it looks kind of like a link-based button. Now we can go ahead and define the changes we want to make to the link button based off of the original button itself. In our case, what are those changes? We want to start by clearing the background. We don't want that purple color in place. We'll set background to none. Then we're going to go ahead and move on to just wiping the border. Border none on all sides. Then there are just 2 more. We're going to set the color equal to the off-white value, which we already have in place. We have a variable off-white for that. And last up, we're just going to go ahead and reset the padding, setting the padding equal to 0. Now we have a modified version of the button we can put into place. So let's go ahead and see what that actually looks like. We're going to go ahead and tweak the remove all button that lives inside of the options component. And currently this sits on 1 line. Let's go ahead and break it out. So when we add class name, it's not taking up too much space. I'm going to go ahead and break it out, putting all of the attributes on their own line. And we're going to add a new one right here, class name. Now, what exactly do we put in here? Well, we still use the regular block. We have button for that. Then after a space, we provide the modifier, which is button, obviously with 2 T's, not 1 or 3, hyphen link. Now we have all of the styles from the button with the modified link-based button, and the end result is what we see over inside of the browser. It's exactly what we want. We have the style looking exactly like the final style is going to be. Now, obviously, we have other buttons inside of our application. If I add items, each item has a button itself, and that's going to be the exact same thing. So we can knock that out as well. That lives over inside of the option component. We have our button sitting right here. All we need to do is add the same 2 classes. Class name equals, we're going to use the button class. We're going to use the modifier button hyphen link. And if we go ahead and save the options file, the option file, all of our buttons now are in their final form. Obviously, the stuff surrounding the buttons still needs a lot of work, but we can see the remove and the remove all button all using the final styles as well as add option. So that is it for this video. In this one, we set up our button file. We have our big button. We also have our regular button with the modified link version. And remember, the modifier syntax is just the original block you're changing, in this case button, followed by 2 hyphens, followed by whatever name you want to pick. So if I have a header and I have an alternative header for a specific page, I might have something like header --alt. That would be an alternative version of the regular header. For our purposes, we just have a link version of that generic purple button. Now that we have all of this in place, we are going to continue styling the application. That's coming up next, so stay tuned. I'll see you then.